Hey guys, my name is Amir Kibani, and I'm a third year medical student at the Alabama College of Osteopathic Medicine. And today you're listening to Do or Do Not. On our podcast, we typically highlight the successes and triumphs of osteopathic physicians. On today's episode, we will follow the story of Dr. Richard Morgan, a physical medicine and rehabilitation physician who strayed from his successful career secondary to an addiction to controlled substances. Dr. Morgan will give us insight into his dark years by giving us a first-hand account of the opioid epidemic in the United States. Dr. Morgan discloses to us how his addiction ruined his life and career. Ultimately, he will share with us his repentance and how the osteopathic community has supported his recovery. He will tell us about his current efforts to give back to the society by narrating his story so others can build the courage to get help and learn from his mistakes. His story is one of warning and one that needs to be told.
Rich, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for inviting me, Dr. Storch. It's a real pleasure.
Rich, I'm going to call you Rich. I know we talked about that. Please call me Ian. Is that okay?
Yeah, no problem, Ian. Absolutely.
Okay, Rich. So, Rich, today, obviously, your story is going to be much different than what we usually do on the podcast. And Adina Leader is a neurologist that we had on our show recently. And when I asked her who would be a good person to interview, I'm always looking for DOs to interview, she quickly came up with your name. And again, this is a much different story than what we usually do, but I think the value to the listeners is maybe more important than some of our other interviewers. So let's just start. Rich, what are you doing now during the week? Are you working at NYCOM now?
Yeah, I just came on as a full-time clinical instructor professor. I am teaching the classes that we call DPR 1 and 2, which I'm sure anyone who's graduated there is familiar with. The classes include doctor-patient relationship, and it teaches first and second year students on how to perform and hone their skills in interviewing patients and performing basic clinical skills. And each week we perform a different set of systems. So they really get a lot of education and clinical preparation for their rotations in third and fourth year.
Yeah, that's amazing. So you are working at NYCOM helping the students, which is, again, amazing. And we're going to come back to that at the end. So Rich, just briefly, where did you grow up and where did you go to college?
I grew up in Long Island, in Woodmere, Long Island. Grew up as the middle child, my older sister, younger brother. Grew up, went to Lawrence High School, went to Union College up in Schenectady, New York, where I majored in biology, minored in classics, and graduated back in 1993. And I started applying to schools, did some research, took a year off to do some research, and then ultimately chose NYCOM and started at the time we called it NYCOM back in 1995.
Okay, Rich. So you spent 4 years at NYCOM and then you had to choose a specialty. And can you tell us what you chose for your residency?
Yeah, I was playing it back and forth. I decided to pursue a career in PM&R. So I went into the NYU program in the city. I joined their residency program and I got board certified in physical medicine and rehabilitation back in 2002.
Okay, so you did PM&R. That's a pretty prestigious place, right, for PM&R.
Yeah, the good thing about them was it's an allopathic school and they just started getting a lot of positive feedback. They were taking in a couple of DOs, osteopaths, and I was in a class where they had just had a lot of success in placing and really were very happy with the osteopathic students from NYCOM. So I was blessed to be part of that influx of osteopathic students into an allopathic school because there weren't a lot of osteopathic PM&R programs back then. So yeah, I went into there and that's where I started my training.
All right. So everything's going great. You grew up on Long Island, you go to medical school, you get into a great PM&R program in the city, you graduate, and then where did you end up starting to work?
I started to work in a practice in Midtown with another osteopath, a graduate of the PM&R program who graduated 2 years before me. I worked with him in Murray Hill on 39th and Madison. I worked in kind of like an outpatient physical therapy practice that incorporated a lot of like weekend warrior types, I maintained some educational background where I was still doing some lecturing and teaching and kept clinical professorship over at NYU. So I was working with some of the students there. I kept all my close contacts there. And I just continued to pursue my independent practice. I was an associate. I think in retrospect, I would have liked to do something different, maybe become more independent, but joining as an associate in the practice, I think is not like the best choice for me, but I ended up making the best of it.
Okay. And then at some point, obviously things, everything's looking great, and then things start to go bad. So
yeah,
can you talk to us a little bit? And that's, again, the end of the story. We know you're at NYCOM and you're teaching. We're going to get there, but we're going to go down sort of a different path. Can you tell us what happened?
Yeah, well, the path actually started if you really go back, it started as a med student. The very first exposure I had to my dark recesses of my problem began back in 1997 when I was a third-year medical student at NYCOM. I started on my clinical rotations in OBGYN, and I developed a tooth infection. I required to have all my wisdom teeth pulled. And the first three went fine, but the fourth one was the problem. The fourth one, I developed a horrible abscess in my mouth, the abscess caused me to have lockjaw, 105, 104-degree fever. I was bedbound for about a week and a half, and I had to go to an oral surgeon to get it drained. And that was my first exposure to opiate painkillers. I started off, no problem. I mean, I was in a lot of pain, and ironically enough, the whole irony of everything is I didn't like to take pills. I actually hadn't had a pill since I was like 5 years old. I had an ear infection back then, and I had a horrible gag reflex. I never was like a fan of pills. So the whole irony of this was I was in so much pain, I had no choice but to try to suck it up and try to take these pills. And that's really what led me, ironically, to the beginning of what these pills did to me and how it kind of like evolved over time. It didn't happen overnight. It was a very insidious evolution of a real, real bad drug addiction. But it all started with that abscess and the wisdom teeth extraction back 23 years ago.
That's unbelievable. So that was in medical school. Did it continue through medical school, and then how did things start to get bad?
It was very slow. I mean, it's not like it just overnight, all of a sudden I'm doing crazy stuff. But what happened was there's a real gray area, Ian, where you start to take pills for what their purpose is intended, for the pain. And then very slowly, over time, what happened was there might be a few times where I'm taking it as prescribed. And even though it wasn't really required, I just took it because the pain might have been, instead of a 5 or 6, it might have been a 2, but I was still taking it. And then I noticed something weird was happening. My brain was just lighting up in a way. I started to develop kind of a euphoric feeling, like it was a very good feeling. And there was some point where the pain, even though it wasn't just the pain being dull, but once it seems like the pain is gone and the pills continue, there's like this transition where it just becomes a very positive, amazing feeling. And it's very hard to describe unless anyone has been in my shoes, I know a lot of people have, because I'm not the first and I'm sure I won't be the last, which is one of the reasons I'm here. But I really think that what happens is it takes over you. But like I said, the first few times you do it, first few times I did it, it develops this intense feeling of invincibility. It gave me a level of confidence that I couldn't believe. Like, wow, this feels amazing. And I felt like, for some reason, that I can do anything. And I felt like I did anything better while I was on them. So like I would start to make up excuses for myself. Like I would say, oh, you know what? If I'm going to be in a social event, I seem like I'm funnier or I'm more engaging, I'm more fun to be around. I would then again take a few pills like that. And it kind of evolved that way. I started to, what addicts tend to describe as, minimize, justifying, and rationalizing the pill use or the drug use. And that's kind of what I did. And it really just evolved from there.
Yeah. And Richard, just to be clear, to understand, it was never like IV drugs or illicit drugs. This was all prescription pills.
Yeah, no, this was all prescription drugs. It's like I said, it started off with a few prescriptions, and even the first few times I would just get the refill, getting a refill here, a refill there. And then I noticed, it was always pills though. But the first signs of there being an issue in retrospect, when I started to look back at it, was I'd be on rotations and I was still a medical student. And I said, you know what, I really could use a little boost. It almost felt like I needed something just to give me that little bit of energy or that pep, which is ironic because most people don't think of opiates as a stimulant. It's more of a depressant. But for whatever reason, it did give me that kind of level of confidence and stimulus that helped me get through the day. That's what worked for me. And some people talk about having like a rebound effect or like a contralateral effect to what some pills, like some stimulants cause depression, some depressants cause active stimulants. So for me, it just happened to be what worked. And I wasn't looking for it. It found me, but I certainly didn't shy away from it. And it was all pills though, and patches too later on. The fentanyl patches I did take for a period of experimentation, if you will.
Now, were you asking for help at any point during this period, or was it just you didn't feel that there was a problem?
I didn't really feel like it was a problem. I just felt like I was going through my day. It was helping me get through my day. And it's funny because, I can look back and I thought of all the crazy things I did. And it's so true that people go through any lengths to get their addiction satiated and met. And I wasn't asking for help because I never really think I needed help early on. It wasn't until about 5 years, maybe 6 years in, that I realized I had a real problem. And at that point, I was like a runaway train. It gets to a point where the guilt and shame for what I was doing overran the need for help. And I felt like I was too far gone by then. So it kind of just spiraled out of control, if you will. It was very difficult for me to kind of like cope with all of the different feelings and emotions going on, because not only was I feeding my head and trying to give myself and chase that high that I had the very first few times, it developed and morphed into something more than that, Ian. It became a point where I had to prevent the withdrawal symptoms. And that was even worse than anything. I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy. And anyone who's ever been dope sick from heroin, which is the same as basically opiates or prescription heroin, it has the same adverse effect. And the feelings were awful. And that's when I realized I really needed help, when I had the dope sickness going on.
Richard, can you describe that?
The feeling is, when you're on the highest doses that I was on, and I would go, let's say 24 hours without taking these pills, what would happen to my body is just like it would go into shutdown mode. Suddenly I would have these sharp, painful headaches. I'm talking like a knife in the side of my head. Awful. I mean, debilitating, like almost like I know what someone having a migraine was going through. But it wasn't just a headache. It was an absolute chill, like a shaking, feverish chill. I would become cramped, nauseous, vomiting. My bowels wouldn't be able to hold up. I was literally diaphoretic. I would wake up in the morning and I'd be crawled up in a ball. And my wife, who was, we were together at the time, she would look over and like, "Are you okay?" And I'm like, "No." I was like, "I cannot go to work today." But because of my background, it was easy for me to convince people that I just had a flu. I just was not feeling well. I was overworking myself. I always came up with excuses for everything. I was too ashamed to admit what I was doing. So I came up with a lot of different excuses and was able to convince people that it was just a sickness. So it got really bad. But the dope sickness is something I absolutely wouldn't wish. I mean, you think of all those things that I just said, Ian, and for all the students out there, and then multiply that by 100. That's how bad it was, and that's how debilitating it was. Nothing would get rid of these withdrawal symptoms except for the opiates. And that was when I realized, you promise yourself, I swear I'll never take another pill. And then the second I get a pill and the symptoms go away, I'm like, thank God, I feel better. All right, so when am I getting my next prescription? And that's what it was like. And, the methodology for me getting my prescriptions was a whole thing on its own. I mean, I developed an entire system for that as well in the height of my addiction. So
the height of your addiction, was that while you were practicing PM&R?
Yeah, it was right after my board certification, probably between 2003 to 2006. Those are the 3 really tough years. Those were the dark years in my my addiction. I had just graduated the boards, and it really came down to when I had actually discovered the king of the kings of opiates, which is Oxy. And I was just taking Vicodin or Tylenol number 3 or Tramadol up until then. And what happened was, and for those students out there who are unaware, Vicodin and pills like that contain a kicker inside of it. And what I mean by that is this Tylenol, this caffeine, there's something in there that can adversely affect you. And the doses of the Vicodin and things I was taking that had another base in them, they were adversely affecting me. I would develop a lot of like right upper quadrant pain when I took a lot of Vicodin. And that would signify a hepatitis or an inflammation of my liver. And I got really scared, me knowing the methodology and the mechanism of action and what these pills contain. I knew it wasn't healthy for me to take a very high dose. But what happened was I had a patient back in my office in Murray Hill in Midtown, and the patient was post-op major back surgery. And I had written him a prescription for oxycodone, 80 milligrams. And he brought the bottle back to me like 2 days later saying, Dr. Morgan, I can't take these pills. They're too strong. So I put them for safekeeping. I just put them in my drawer. I didn't even think about it. And then what happened was I was getting some really bad like muscle spasms in my shoulder blades, shoulder girdles, and I didn't have anything else on me. I'm like, you know what? At this point, I was already making enough bad decisions. Let me try one of these. So this is one of the first watershed moments in my life where I decided to take one of those oxys, and it helped my pain, but it did much more than that. It gave me a new level of standard for what euphoria was, because wherever I thought it was for the Vicodins of the world and the milder opiates, this was like 100-fold more intense, but positive in my eyes. It was a much more euphoric and amazing feeling to me. And after I took that, I was simply off to the races. There was just no stopping me. And then from that point on, I think I was willing to do pretty much anything to try to maintain that particular high.
Richard, you alluded that you had sort of an intricate system for getting these pain pills. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely, Ian. So what I was doing was, for the old school students out there who don't know, when we were going through school, we didn't have iPhones, we didn't have smartphones, and I hadn't seen a smartphone until I got home. But I had a Razor phone. But what we did have was Palm Pilots. So for those students out there who want to Google Palm Pilot, you'll see what I had. And it was just a small device that I was able to store notes and information, phone numbers on. So what I was doing was I started going and utilizing various pharmacies in Nassau County and Manhattan, where I was doing a lot of my work. And what I do was on the PDA, on the Palm Pilot, I would keep track of a number of pharmacies, with each one using a fake name, an address, a date of birth, and a phone number. So I had the phone number of the pharmacy and then the prescription number, so that back then, Vicodin and prescriptions like that and oxys were triplicate, but Vicodin wasn't triplicate. Vicodin was a Schedule 3 drug. So for people who don't realize, you can have refills on that. So I was getting refills on Vicodin, and I was doing like, I would fill a prescription. Say I'd go into a pharmacy, I'd take my own pad, and I'd write a fake name on top, John Smith, let's say. And I'd write down OxyContin, 60 pills, 1 tab POQ, 4 to 6 hours PRN. And what I would do was, on the script, I would write down a diagnosis like recurrent tibial stress fracture. I'd make up like a nice, easy to understand thing that might not be good for the layman, but the pharmacist would understand it. This is how crazy I was. And in addition to giving the pharmacist the prescription for the painkiller, I would always give an antibiotic like amoxicillin. Ironically enough, I was allergic to amoxicillin, but I always felt the need to give that so that it would diminish the need for any guilt or any concerns on the part of the patient, where the pharmacist wouldn't really question it, because I'm coming in with 2 prescriptions for the same condition. So I would go in pretending to be John Smith. I'd give the pharmacist my information. He would always ask me if I've ever been here. I was like, yeah, but I don't have any insurance. So, and on the top of the prescription, I wrote my cell phone number. I would say the doctor asked me to write down his number. He said he's not in his office a lot, but he takes calls a lot. So what I would do is I'm going to come back and pick the prescription up in an hour. They said, fine. And then what would happen was they would always call the doctor, which was me, and I'd be in the parking lot or like, a little bit close by, and I'd be like, hello, this is Dr. Morgan, and hi, this is so-and-so from the pharmacy. We're just calling to confirm a prescription for Mr. Smith. I'd be like, yes, absolutely. He's a patient of mine. I wrote down a prescription for tibial stress fracture and amoxicillin. My DEA number is blah, blah, blah. And that was it. And then I would go back like 35 minutes later. I'd have my prescription. I'd pay in cash. And I always got it. Not always. There were certain pharmacies that were a lot easier than others. So the intricacy of how I did it too was I would only go to one pharmacy every month. So I kept a list. I remember I mentioned the Palm Pilot earlier. I had on my Palm Pilot 25 to 30 different pharmacies, and I kept track of every single fake name, number, address, and date of birth on each pharmacy that I used. And I made sure to keep them cataloged so that I never went to the same pharmacy more than once per month. So I would keep track so that I would go to like 2 to 3 pharmacies a week and fill them for myself. And then the following week use different pharmacies. And I had to be careful because if I went too soon, I knew I would draw attention to myself. But this shows you the level of business in my addiction and how, as an addict, I was willing to go through any lengths to feed my head. And, looking back, it's crazy. But you know what? For anyone who's been there and had done anything like this, that's what it took. That's the level that I went to feed my habits. And, it wasn't pretty, and I know in today's day and age, with all the systems of check and balances and electronic prescription writing, it's not something that people can easily get away with these days. But back then, it was really not that hard.
So you have a problem, but you're going through withdrawal. So you're continuing to, most people know that it takes more and more, higher and higher dosage to get the same effect over time. So obviously the dose is escalating and you're sort of in this vicious cycle. At what point did the floor finally fall out?
Well, the floor finally fell out where I was basically, this is what happened. It fell out on a couple of different levels. The first level was when I realized that the oxys were really expensive and it was hard to afford, even on a doctor's salary. They were like $10 a pill and I was taking, generics and they were still expensive. But what I needed to do was find a substitute, something that would help me and hopefully mollify some of the symptoms where I wouldn't just have to use oxy. And that's when I discovered Xanax. So what I was doing was I started taking Xanax, which is obviously pennies on the dollar compared to oxy. I was taking those at night or later in the afternoon to mollify a lot of the symptoms. Again, just like opiates, Xanax is a depressant. So one wouldn't normally think of them as something that would, be used to negate symptoms of opiate withdrawal, but for whatever reason, it worked for me. The problem was I started to have horrible side effects with the Xanax. I was having really bad, I had several episodes where I was falling asleep, didn't remember I fell asleep. I would have episodes where I fell asleep in front of patients. I fell asleep in front of when I got home from work, I fell asleep at the dinner table several times. I mean, it was really bad. But the worst part was, Ian, I didn't remember a lot of this stuff. And that all came to a head back in 2006 when I was going to meet a friend of mine at a Ranger playoff game, believe it or not. I'm an Islander fan. And I ended up going, and I never made it. I was leaving an office I was working at in Manhattan. I took a bunch of pills, and I fell asleep on a park bench somewhere in the middle of the city. And I had like $2,000 on my pocket. I had an EMG machine that I was using, and I think I fell asleep and my money was gone. I don't even know what happened. I don't know if it was stolen or not, but I missed the hockey game. My friend was freaking out. My wife didn't know where I was. I ended up getting home that night, and I got a call, and they basically were freaked out. And I just said, I don't know what happened. But the next day I went to work as if nothing happened. And then I came home, and my family was there and had an intervention with me. And that was like rock bottom from a standpoint where like people couldn't deal with me anymore. But the one thing I really want to share was I haven't really talked about the illegalities of what I did. I'm talking just about the addiction. But right when I started pursuing the oxys, okay, what happened was I was working at an office through the practice I was at in Murray Hill. It was out in Farmingdale, Long Island. And I was going to an urgent care center to do EMGs on Fridays. And one day I was in there and I had just started taking the oxys and I was doing it and I was liking it. But what happened was there were a couple of young kids doing some smurfing. Now, smurfing, what I learned is like doctor shopping, where people are trying to divert pills into their pockets for the benefit of financial gain. So these kids were coming to my office. They were coming to see me and find out and ask me if I was willing to, they had some pain, this and that. And they said they were willing to pay just for a couple of prescriptions. And they would throw like $1,500 down or $2,000 down just for a few scripts. And at first I was like, I ain't going to do that. What are you talking about? I'm going to do that crap. I mean, what do you think I am? And then what happened was they threw out a little bit more. And then in my sick mind, my sick warped mind, another watershed moment came upon me, Ian. And I said, you know what? If I just do this one time, this will give me enough money to help feed my head with my own habit. So I decided to write a few scripts, gave it to them, use that money to continue to feed my head. And that was the first time I had ever sold prescriptions. And, and I kept, like I said, minimizing, justifying, and rationalizing my prescription writing by saying I'm just using it this one or two times, and I'm just going to use it with a couple of people so I can feed and pay for my prescriptions. And, and I continued to just use a few people. But what happened was like 3 or 4 weeks after that one time, I came to that office, Ian. There were, I'm not kidding you, about 15, 20 young kids outside that practice waiting for me. And I got really, really pissed. I yelled and screamed at these kids, like, what the hell do you think you're doing? This is crazy. And here I am. I'm playing the victim here. But in essence, I instigated this whole thing by starting it, by allowing myself to be manipulated, but also being responsible because I'm the adult here and I should know better. So I'd sent them all away, and they begged and pleaded to please just, we won't ever get anyone else involved. It'll just be us. And they try to make peace with me. And finally, a week or two later, I said, fine, but no other people. And again, I justified by saying, well, it was just 2 or 3 people, so it was okay. And that's how that continued on throughout everything else that was going on, throughout my oxy use, my Xanax use. I experimented with some fentanyl here and there. So yeah, and that's kind of how that took off. But the rock bottom, I would have to say, was literally at that point. It was the day that I went into treatment. But prior to the real rock bottom was the day in 2007 where everything came crashing down and I lost my freedom.
So Richard, first of all, I just, maybe I should save this to the end, but just your strength in sharing this story with us, I just want to make sure that everyone listening understands how difficult, and I'm looking at your face as you're telling the story. This is not an easy story to tell, obviously. So you just said when you lost your freedom.
May 14th, 2007, I was leaving my house to go to work like any other day. And I'm leaving my house and I have a Toyota Camry. I click on the button and I open the door to get in my car and I hear Dr. Morgan, and I turn around and there were 3 SUVs that came out of nowhere, Ian, and they literally handcuffed me within 10 seconds, threw me against the car, said that you're under arrest for distribution of illegal drugs. And they said they read me my Miranda rights, but everything was a blur. I look over as I'm handcuffed against the car. I look over and I see 2 DEA agents walking up the door to my wife and my 2-year-old daughter that are standing there. And I watch them go in there looking for guns, looking for legal prescriptions. Of course, there's no guns, and they come out with a box. And from there, that moment, my life changed forever. Because I asked myself this all the time, Ian, like, how does a distinguished physician who has a wife, 2 beautiful daughters, and a respected job end up serving time and spending the next 48 hours on a rat-infested Nassau County jail cell after only 10 years earlier to ever taking the first pill I ever took in my life. And it just goes to show you the speed, the intensity, and how fast one can fall from one mistake or one event in life. And literally from the moment I took my first pill, Ian, literally almost 10 years ago to 10 years to the day, I was arrested by the federal government. And I'm not saying everyone makes bad choices in life, and I made some horrible choices, and I own them all. I am fully responsible for all my actions, but I have atoned for my sins, and I'm here to share my story because I want this message out there. I want people to realize that I was just like them. I sat bushy-haired and blue-eyed and sitting in my classrooms in med school listening to the professors And if there was someone like me standing there sharing this story with them, then I know that if I heard my story 25 years ago, Ian, I might not be here today.
Richard, how long were you in jail for?
I was sentenced to 168 months, Ian, 14 years. So I was sentenced on May 19, 2009. It was 2 years after I got arrested. So what happened was I got arrested. I got out on bond. And even though I wasn't using anymore, I was like what you'd call a dry drunk. I was exhibiting relapse behavior. I got remanded into custody on March 22nd, 2009, 2 months before my sentencing, by the way. Because what happened was I still had a comfort thing with pills, even though I couldn't take them anymore. So what I was doing was I substituted my addiction for Sudafed. So I started popping Sudafed, Ian, and I was taking an inordinate amount of Sudafed. I was taking like an entire blister pack from the pharmacy. And what I didn't realize, and maybe I should have because I really wasn't paying attention, was that there's a Methamphetamine Control Act of 2005 that was passed that limits the purchase of Sudafed to 9 grams within a 1 month period. And apparently I bought like 12 grams over 2 months each. And I was red flagged into Albany in the database, and then the feds put out another warrant for my arrest. So 2 months prior to my sentencing, instead of showing up at my sentencing in a 3-piece suit, I showed up in an orange jumpsuit, a federal jumpsuit, and I ended up getting 168 months. So I sentenced to 14 years. I did not do 14 years. I've been blessed with a lot of positive things during my time away, some lucky, some self-made. Obama actually wrote a commuted sentence for me. He passed a law that allowed first-time nonviolent drug offenders to get a 2-point reduction in their sentencing guideline. For me, that meant 2 points meant 33 months. So I got 33 months knocked off my sentence. On top of that, I did an inpatient drug rehab program, which gave me another 12 months off my sentence. I lived in an inpatient community in Morgantown, West Virginia. And then finally, I got 9 months halfway house. All in all, Ian, I got 49 months taken off of my 168-month sentence. So instead of doing 168, I ended up doing just a couple months shy of 9 years.
So, Richard, I feel your pain hearing this story, and obviously just talking to you for the last hour and talking to Adina about you, you are a good person and are a good doctor. Just briefly, I assume, what happened to your medical license at this point?
So my medical license, they said that you have a chance to voluntarily surrender it prior to revocation. So I actually mailed my license back to them, and I voluntarily surrendered it. What that allowed me to do was it allows the door to be open in such a time in the near future, in the distant future, or whatever it might be, that I could fight to try to get it back. So because I left that and because I voluntarily surrendered it, I received a letter that I am in good standing with the Albany Medical Board and OPMC, the Office of Professional Medical Conduct, in the sense that because I did the right thing and I proactively did that, it allows me a chance to get my license back.
Richard, you're released from jail, right? And now, please tell us what you've been doing. I mean, obviously, this whole situation has been horrible for you.
On a personal level, I went 9 years without seeing my wife and kids. So that was hard enough. So when I was on Dr. Oz about 2 years ago, and he shared this whole thing with me about what was that like to not be with your kids? And it was very tough, but honestly, I made the most of it. I spoke to them 3 times a week. I wrote them letters. I had email with them. I really kept vigilant in touch with them through the phone. So the first meeting with them was intense. It was like a Hallmark moment. I was absolutely in tears. It was one of the most hardest things, but the most beautiful things I ever did. That moment where I finally saw them again, and I had missed almost 9 years of their life. But every day I work towards building up that relationship, and it's getting amazing every day. And I'm so proud of them, and they're actually proud of me. We've come a long way together. In addition, what I did was, because I didn't have a job, I met someone who got me into working in a restaurant. And I actually started working in a brand new restaurant in Brooklyn called Sugarcane. And I was able to be one of the original servers when they opened up their doors. And I learned how to be a server. I was very humble about it. I was happy about it. It was one of my favorite 3 years of my life. I loved every day. I went to work enjoying it. I made a living and I supported myself. I sent whatever I could to my family, but it was hard. It wasn't easy. And then what happened, Ian, was something amazing. So we spoke about Adina Leader. So Adina and Jeff Muller, her husband, who's also on staff at NYCOM, they kept in touch with me a little bit. But basically, when I came home, they were one of the first people to call me to see how I was doing. And I was really touched. And Adina said, Rich, I'm going to talk to the dean. It was Peter Dane, Dr. Dane. And he says, you got to come to NYCOM and share your story. So 2.5 years ago, I came to the school, and in front of 300 students, because they made my talk mandatory for all first years, in front of the entire faculty, I shared most of my story with a little bit more intensity and a little bit more in depth. And I was blessed with a standing round of ovation. I had students line up, about 25 of them, and came up to me, a couple of them crying, saying, you changed my life. I had one student I'll never forget, Ian, that came up to me and said, I'm so glad I heard you speak today, because I broke my ankle and I actually have a prescription for Vicodin at home right now. As soon as I get home, Dr. Morgan, I'm going home to throw that out. And I cried right there. And I said, you know what? I said to that student, and I said, you are the reason why I was here today, not anyone else. I said, if I can change one person's life out of 300, then I did my job. And I was so happy for that person. It really touched me. And then there was a doctor there, Carlos, I forget his last name. And he says, Dr. Dane, if you don't hire this guy, you're freaking crazy. So they invited me back to speak the following year at the same. It's called a CPR, Clinical Practice Reflections. They made it again mandatory, and I spoke again to the next year's first-year students, and I got the same positive response. And then 2 months later, Dr. Dane calls me in his office and says, listen, we're so impressed with you. We'd like to offer you a part-time job. I mean, you're family. You're one of us. They offered me a part-time job. So last year, I taught DPR 1. The class I mentioned earlier, doctor-patient relationship, and I taught for this whole past year. Meanwhile, COVID hits in March. I lost my restaurant job. Oh my God. I literally have 2 months left on my contract with NYCOM, and now I'm like, NYCOM, and I'm like, oh God, I'm really screwed now. I started collecting unemployment, and then I got a call, I'll never forget, Ian. I get a call from Dr. Bono, Nancy Bono. Nancy Bono is the department head of family medicine at NYCOM, who I happen to actually do residency with at Long Beach Medical Center. I did my clinical rotations there. And so we knew each other. We trained together. So she says, Richard, she's like, I just want you to know that everybody in life deserves a second chance. And she says, I want to offer you a full-time job. And I literally dropped my coffee. My jaw just dropped, and I literally I started crying again. And she's like, I'm like, are you serious? Is this a prank? She's like, no. And I said, I would love to work there full time. And it changed my life. And now not only do I get to be blessed to be able to be a full-time staff at NYCOM and NYCOM and work there every day and work with the students. Dr. Ballantyne, who had a meeting with me, also said, Richard, I want you to be transparent. I want you to share your story. I want everyone to know what you've been through, because they need to hear you. And that's why I'm here with you today, Ian, because that's how powerful that I want to make this message, and how important it is for them to realize and understand not only the power of addiction, but the power of responsibility that the students are being placed into, and how important it is for them to really aware that the power of the pen is really strong. And it's very easy to lose your way if you forget where you've been. And I think by hearing my story early on and understanding the signs and symptoms of addiction, I think can make a huge difference in one's life early on, so that they never make the mistakes I made.
Richard, again, I really thank you for spending the time talking to me today. My experience, just to share just a short story and maybe your reflections on that story. I think a lot of people listening may be judgmental or not fully understand the whole situation and how these things can happen to good people who do not have any moral or, just like yourself, who's just a good doctor and a good person that just ends up in a situation that they can't control. And my story is, I remember specifically a young man who came in to see me who had Crohn's disease and a pararectal abscess, which, for those of you that don't understand, sometimes young people can get a disease called Crohn's, where there are tracts that form between the GI tract and the skin. And you can form an abscess, which, if it's not drained, becomes almost like a dental infection, as you had, Richard, when this whole thing started. So, I sent him to a surgeon to have him it drained and put him on antibiotics. But I also gave him a prescription for narcotics, which, again, I felt was appropriate because of the severity of the pain from the infection. But he ultimately became addicted to Percocet. And with the help of his mother, it was a very difficult situation. We were able to, he ended up going into inpatient rehab ultimately. And, as a doctor, I felt that I had done this to him. This was sort of my fault. So, I think about this all the time when I write prescription narcotics, about this young man. And certainly narcotics have a role in medicine, and we want to have people's pain controlled. We don't want them to suffer. That's part of our job. Mm-hmm. Can you comment maybe on the story I just told you and maybe give some insight into both doctors that are writing narcotics and for students?
Absolutely. And first of all, let me just say this. I don't think that you should ever blame or feel responsible. We don't create, and if doctors get it in their heads that they're creating addicts, then we're unable to do our job efficiently. Because like you just said, I really believe that narcotics do have a place in medicine when used the appropriate way for a limited period of time. Without a doubt, I feel that. You have cancer patients, you have people with horrible leg and limb deformities, most post-motor vehicle accidents. And I hear this a lot, what's the role that opiates have in medicine? And I definitely think there's a role, but I also agree with you. I'll never forget an article I read while I was actually in prison about Big Brother watching. And what's scary is that physicians got scared to write opiates because of the federal government watching every single script they write. And when you are being watched like that, like a hawk, and you can't effectively do your job to treat someone because you're worried about backlash or worried about pushback from someone else who has the power to revoke your license or to do something worse to you, then you're unable to effectively do your job. And I'll never forget reading about how fearful a lot of physicians got from writing prescriptions and then getting a letter like, oh, people are monitoring them. Like, so if you weren't a pain management specialist or you weren't an orthopedic surgeon and you're just a family practice doctor, or you're someone who shouldn't be writing scripts, who is the government to tell us what we should or shouldn't be doing? I mean, what level of government control do we have in medicine? And that's the scary thing, Ian, because I think that medicine has been adversely affected. Do I think there's a lot of bad apples, the people that did what I did? Absolutely. I don't think as many people, though, the one difference, and I met a lot of doctors like me, but the one thing that I think I have that a lot of doctors don't have, Ian, is remorse. I met so many doctors with these egos that you would not freaking believe. They were like, I did nothing wrong. I wrote scripts that were justified. I mean, I literally would watch these people with half the sentences I had. I had 14 years. They'd have 6, 7 years. And they're screaming and kicking in prison, talking about how they wrote all these scripts were justified. Everything they did was justified. They refused to take responsibility and accept anything they did was wrong. At the same level, there's so many good physicians out there that I really feel are being held back from doing the right thing. And it's a shame because they're holding back on giving someone who justifiably may need an opiate that they won't write because of the fear of repercussions. And that's the scary thing. And I don't even know the answer, Ian. There's a real fine line between writing a prescription when it's justified and then writing it where you have to worry about looking a little bit over your shoulder. And there's no right or wrong answer, but I am totally in support of doing the right thing. And I really believe that opiates do have a place in medicine.
Richard, I guess my last question is, what advice would you give? Like, let's say there's a young person, man or woman, in medical school that goes for a dental procedure and starts taking Percocet, is listening to this interview and says, oh my God, I think I can't believe this story, and that's a road that I may be headed down. Where would you recommend they start, and what should they do?
A great question, Ian. And there doesn't go a day where I don't play out my entire life story and look at the road less traveled. And I think the number one piece of advice I will tell anyone, I wish they could see my eyes right now. This is why I like to do these things in person. Never be afraid to ask for help. Know that people are just like you that are struggling with this disease. And if you feel that you have a problem, don't be proud. Don't be so proud to think that you can handle it on your own. There's people out there that are willing to help you. And I found that out the hard way, but I still found it out. And you know what? I wouldn't be here today and I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing if I ultimately didn't ask for help. And the fact is, there's a couple of wonderful organizations that they can always go to, especially for doctors. The biggest one is MSSNY, the Medical State Society of New York. It sponsors a program called CPH. CPH is the Committee for Physicians' Health. They're based in Albany, and they're an advocacy group for any physician they can be report themselves, they can be reported by someone else, and they do the proper investigation. And they're an advocacy group that will help you if you ever need to go before the medical board to get your license back and do everything you need to do to kind of follow the right path towards recovery. And they help a lot of people with substance abuse. So it's a beautiful thing. And I'm a part of them now because, like I said before, CPH is great. And I mentioned my license, and I'm blessed to be able to get a chance to get it back now. I'm with CPH. I could have it back within a year or two, which is honestly unheard of in my situation. To go 9 years in federal prison and then to be able to even be in a position to have it back, is an amazing feeling. But the fact is, even if I don't get it back, I'm okay with that too, because I've already won. I'm where I love teaching the You Future Doctors of America, and I love what I'm doing right now at NYCOM, and it's really made me a better person than what I was before.
Richard, again, your story is incredible. We wish you all the success and that you obviously deserve. And thank you for spending time with us today.
Thank you so much, Ian. It's been a pleasure. And I really hope that we can help some people out there who are struggling, because this disease is real. And we got that COVID pandemic, but you know what? The opiate pandemic, I'm sorry, is worse. It's gonna kill a lot more people over a much longer period of time. We need to keep that in mind as we move forward, that the opiate pandemic is just as bad as the COVID pandemic.
Again, thank you, Richard.
Thank you.
This concludes our episode of Do or Do Not. Send all inquiries, comments, suggestions, and even let us know if there's someone you want us to interview to doordonotpodcast@gmail.com. Don't forget to like us on Facebook at Do or Do Not Podcast for updates. If you enjoyed our podcast, please share it with your classmates and administration. We have plenty of more interviews lined up, and we're excited to share them with you. This is Tian Yu Shea. Thank you guys so much for listening to Do or Do Not.